What does it take for a single decision to shake the balance of power on an entire continent? Not a war, not a coup, not even an election, just one trade deal worth $2.1 billion that has forced Washington to sit up, pay attention, and perhaps panic. This is the story of how Burkina Faso's leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, turned away from America's orbit, signed a trade pivot that few saw coming, and in doing so, redefined Africa's role in the 21st century global economy. For decades, Africa's trade story has been told by others. America, France, and Europe dictated the rules. Loans from the IMF and World Bank came with heavy conditions. Aid was often tied to political loyalty. But in 2025, something shifted. Traoré's $2.1 billion trade agreement didn't just bring new money into Burkina Faso. It signaled that Africa was ready to choose its own partners, its own priorities, and its own future. This is not just a deal, it's a pivot. And to understand its meaning, we have to start from the beginning. Burkina Faso is one of the poorest nations in the world. Landlocked, limited in infrastructure, heavily reliant on cotton and gold exports. For years, trade was funneled through the West. The United States bought Africa's raw materials cheaply and in return sold expensive finished goods. It was a cycle designed to keep nations like Burkina Faso dependent. Young people, especially in Ouagadougou, saw the pattern. They saw unemployment rise while foreign companies extracted billions from their land. They saw promises of aid, but little real development. By 2022, frustration boiled over. Military leaders stepped in, saying, "Enough." And among them, a young captain, just 34 years old, emerged as the face of defiance. Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré was not a polished politician. He was a soldier, trained in the deserts of the Sahel, where Burkina Faso has long fought extremist groups. But unlike leaders before him, Traoré spoke the language of sovereignty. He said Burkina Faso would no longer be a pawn. His speeches echoed a Pan-African spirit, the idea that Africans should trade with each other, invest in themselves, and look east, not just west, for partnerships. So when whispers began in late 2024 that Burkina Faso was negotiating a massive trade agreement, outside of America's influence, many dismissed it as symbolic, until it wasn't. In early 2025, Traoré signed a deal worth $2.1 billion with a coalition of non-Western partners. It wasn't aid, it wasn't a loan, it was trade. Burkina Faso would export gold, cotton, and agricultural products. In return, it would import technology, energy infrastructure, and industrial machinery. For the first time, the terms weren't dictated by Washington or Paris. Reports suggest the deal was structured with long-term equity in mind. Burkina Faso retains control of its resources while gaining access to new markets across Asia and Africa. To many Africans, this was revolutionary. On paper, $2.1 billion may not sound earth-shattering. After all, America spends more than that in foreign aid across Africa every year. But the difference lies in symbolism. For decades, Washington relied on what analysts call soft control, influence through trade agreements, security assistance, and aid packages. If Burkina Faso and others now choose alternatives, America's leverage shrinks, and Traoré's pivot is not happening in isolation. Mali, Niger, and Guinea have also begun cutting old colonial ties. West Africa, once seen as France's backyard, and America's ally in the war on terror, is drifting toward a new economic bloc. The $2.1 billion deal was the spark. The fire is regional. In Ouagadougou's central market, traders speak of hope. One shopkeeper said, "If this brings factories here, if my children can work at home instead of leaving, then it is good for us." A cotton farmer near Bobo Dioulasso added, "For years, they bought our cotton cheap. Maybe now, with new partners, we can process it here and make clothes ourselves." But not everyone is convinced. Critics worry that shifting from Western partners to Eastern ones could simply replace one dependency with another. Civil society groups urge the government to prioritize local industry and transparency. Still, the mood in Burkina Faso is clear. For the first time in decades, people feel the country is bargaining from a position of dignity. Traoré's pivot fits into a larger continental trend. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2021, aims to boost trade between African countries themselves. Leaders from Senegal to Tanzania are exploring how to add value at home instead of exporting raw resources abroad. Ghana is building factories to process cocoa. Ethiopia is investing in textile manufacturing. Nigeria is pushing for tech hubs. Burkina Faso's $2.1 billion deal shows that even a small landlocked nation can play the game differently. And it tells bigger economies, you no longer have to play by Washington's script. The deal also signals a global shift. China, Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states are all deepening ties in Africa. America and Europe now face real competition for influence. What makes Traoré's pivot powerful is not just the money, it's the message. Africa is no longer a passive recipient. It is choosing, negotiating, and, crucially, diversifying. For Washington, this is a wake-up call. For Africa, it's an opening. So what does Traoré's $2.1 billion pivot mean for the world? For Burkina Faso, it may mean new factories, new jobs, and new pride. For Africa, it could mean the beginning of a new trade era, where sovereignty, not dependency, sets the tone. For America, it is a sign that its decades-long grip on African trade is loosening. History rarely changes with a bang. Sometimes it shifts with a signature on a contract. And as the ink dries on Traoré's deal, one thing is clear. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to write its own future. The question now is, who will listen, who will adapt, and who will be left behind?